I just want to make everybody feel welcome here. Thank you guys all very much. My name is Daniel Hintz. I'm with the Velocity Group. We're working with a team of folks in Austin on a wide variety of planning initiatives. And this 2023 Speaker Series is a virtual community learning resource as the strategic planning gets underway. The Speakers Resource is really bringing folks from all over the country, pairing them with community members, stakeholders on the ground doing great work in everything from future growth policy, housing, economic development, immigrant support, food access and equity, like the talk today, parks and open space design, connectivity and transportation, education, arts and culture, brand story, tourism, a wide variety of things that your community is currently working on. The goal is to bring together these dynamic national practitioners together with local leaders to offer inspiration by sharing practical models, working projects, and ideas from across the country and within the city that inform innovative solutions to the challenges and opportunities within Austin, Minnesota. So we'll be having several different upcoming different types of subject matters that will keep you in the loop from. We actually have one tomorrow as well. So you definitely want to keep up with that. And that's combined planning between the city and the county. And so we had a really great opening session with those folks as well. So just get that on your radar screen. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Molly. So thank you very much, Molly, and take it away.
Sounds great. Thanks, Daniel, for the introduction. Just want to confirm everyone can see my PowerPoint okay? Looks like it. Perfect. All right. So glad to be with you here today. I'd like to thank Impact Austin and the Velocity Group for coordinating this event and this series of events. They're certainly beneficial for our community and appreciate you all for taking the time to join us today. Appreciate Impact Austin and the Velocity Group for inviting United Way to share our hometown food security project as it relates to this speaker series topic. My name is Molly Lanke. I'm the Executive Director of the United Way and a co-lead on our hometown food security project. So we're here to talk about food systems, learn about food systems and their impact on our community. And one area of impact is that of food security, which is the primary focus of our hometown food security project currently, but we know that there's a bigger role that we play in the food system, and we're excited to learn more about that today. So what is food security? Food security is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So it's not as simple as you have food, right? There's a lot to consider within the definition of food security. This is what our hometown food security project is all about. But we know that not everyone in our community is food secure, as demonstrated through these Mower County food insecurity statistics shown here. 8.4% of Mower County residents do not have sufficient access to food, increasing to 13.8% for children. So think about that, right? That's nearly 1 in 7 local children who are food insecure, likely unable to focus in school because of pain in their bellies, maybe only relying on, school meals as their only sustainable and consistent source of food. But that's where our Hometown Food Security Project comes in. We know that no one individual, company, or organization can end hunger alone. So we've assembled a coalition to end hunger together. Grateful to Hormel Foods for their support of this project. They're co-leading along with United Way and all of our coalition members. We have great representation on our coalition right now, but it's growing, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation today. But why do we need to solve food insecurity? Because we have a responsibility to do just that. Because food insecurity can and does impact everyone from all walks of life, from students to seniors to communities and beyond. And you might be surprised too, food insecurity is not as easy to recognize as maybe something like homelessness. You never know who's experiencing food insecurity. You never know who might just be one crisis away from becoming food insecure. So that's where our Hometown Food Security project has come together to assess really current assets, gaps, opportunities within the food security landscape, and move the needle so that more community members are food secure. Reflected within food insecurity figures is a food system, and that's what we're here to talk about today. because food systems influence the availability, the accessibility, the affordability, the safety of food, and well-functioning food systems contribute to food security by ensuring that sufficient, safe, nutritious food is produced, distributed, and consumed by all people. Going back to that definition of food security, right? All people have what they need to live a food secure and hunger-free life. We believe that a healthy and sustainable food system is crucial to achieving our Hometown Food Security Project's goal of 3% food insecurity or less. And you can see all of those food system elements within. Right now, average of 10% for 10 years. 1 in 10 Mower County individuals have experienced food insecurity. But we're trying to move that needle, and the elements of a food system are critical as we do so. So I now have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, Karin Endy, a national recognized expert in food systems. She will share lessons on food system strategy development and the various elements to consider in the process, as well as some of the catalytic projects that have played a significant role in advancing the Northwest Arkansas food system. So as we work towards achieving a local food security through our Hometown Food Security Project, Karin's insights will be invaluable in helping us create a more equitable and sustainable food system for our community. So Karin, very fortunate to have you here with us. I know I'm really looking forward to the insights that you can share, and I'll hand it off to you now to walk us through your work.
Thanks, Molly. Really appreciate the good work that you're doing, and thank you for the introduction. And thanks also to Impact Austin and for the Velocity Group for inviting me to share my work with you today. It's definitely a privilege. I really am passionate about what I'm doing and love sharing that with other people and thinking about how we can advance food systems across the country. As you mentioned, I am a national food systems consultant. I've worked on projects across the United States, really at the intersection of food, education, public health, and the economy. When we talk about food systems, economic development is at the heart of all of it because everybody eats, and it takes all of us to move food from the field to the plate. For the last 10 years, I've been supporting the Walton Family Foundation's food work in Northwest Arkansas. It started off as a couple of, I don't want to say random projects, but very specific projects. And when I say project, I mean it wasn't thought about in terms of how we can change a food system. It was, here's a specific thing that we think we would like to do or that our community would like. From there, they took a step back and said, we really want to change the entire food system. It's not working for our community, and we'd like to take a strategic approach. And at that point, we really took a long and hard look. We spent a year on research thinking about what our food system is, what the gaps are, and how we might make it better. So today I'm going to talk about what is a food system and what it means to think strategically about food work, and I'll share the work that I've been leading in Northwest Arkansas. If you can move to the next slide. So what is a food system? Broadly speaking, it's everything needed to move food from the field to the plate. Everybody eats, and food is a part of good health, culture, and the economy. It brings people together, and it can create a shared sense of place. But why are we talking about food systems and not just the food scene or a single thing we'd like to see in our community? From my perspective, the way food moves from the field to the plate has an impact on everything upstream, from the economic impacts, social impacts, and environmental impacts. Broadly speaking, the food system is moving food from the field to the harvest, packing, transporting, retailing, eating, and in a true life cycle system, disposing of it. Part of that goes back into growing our food again. It's actually quite a lot more complicated than that. So if you can move to the next slide. There are a number of subsystems that make up the food system. And I really like this particular graphic because of the way it breaks it up into different systems and how each of the subsystems has a number of different components that we need to think about as we're thinking about what does our food system look like and what does it mean to affect change. The one thing I think this particular graphic doesn't do a great job at is how does food insecurity work fit into this picture? In some sense, it's, I think, part of the economic system, political system, and social system, but maybe it's better to think about food insecurity as part of all of the subsystems and the system as a whole. Because if we really want everybody to eat and everybody to feel food secure, We need to look at where our system is failing individuals that don't get enough delicious and nutritious food on their plates. There are lots of great food projects across the United States and other countries as well. And I think it can be great to pick one project and see how that can impact a community. But from my perspective, to make lasting and meaningful change, it can be helpful to take a step back and look at the system as a whole and what it needs to function effectively, and then select projects that move the whole system forward. Next slide, please. We started with a question, what is your vision for the future? What do you want your community to look like? And from there asked, what do you already know about your food system? What do you need to find out? Thinking about best projects and projects from other regions can be particularly helpful. I think once you understand what your system needs, moving into strategy development, and then from there, we've moved into feasibility studies and made planning grants, implementation grants, and we're always looking at what we've done and assessing, and we'll talk a little bit towards the end about how you measure success in food systems work. Next slide, please. In our work in Northwest Arkansas, we started with conversations with the funder and key stakeholders to understand their vision, what was important to include and exclude. And I'll just pause for a minute and say that I've been really privileged to work with a large family foundation that has the ability to implement the work that they want to see. It has allowed us a freedom and flexibility that not every organization is privileged to have. And I think also from a strategic perspective, to be able to say, these are the specific things that need to happen to move our system, and we know that the funding is going to be there, has allowed us to work in a system-wide approach as opposed to just one-off projects or always trying to chase funding and be subordinate to whatever that particular funder wants to see. So it's allowed us to hold the system strategy and implement the things that move the whole system. So for our funder and key stakeholders, I think it was really important to them that the work that we were doing could be replicable in other regions, that it had to both be specific in that it would apply to the needs of Northwest Arkansas, but they also didn't want to create projects that by their nature would not be able to be replicated anywhere else. And so they held this idea of being a national model as core to the kinds of things that they would be willing to fund and implement. If it was something that would only work because of the funding they would be able to provide or couldn't be done anywhere else, they didn't want to move forward with it. We were clear that this was about local food, and we defined local as within a 200-mile radius of our specific location in Northwest Arkansas. They all aligned on caring deeply about regenerative agricultural practices, and that's sort of where supporting the environment comes in. Everybody was very aligned on supporting local economy, that so many good things come from having a thriving local community economics, and that healthy food access had to be part of this for everybody, that this wasn't going to be a project just so that fancy restaurants had good food or that it could be on the shelves of certain supermarkets. We really wanted to make sure that we could access people where they typically eat, shop, work, and play, meaning that everybody should have access. And then we have the question of affordability. And I'm not going to lie, that's a question we're still grappling with today, is how do we help small farms that have the highest costs of production enter markets where they're competing on a global scale with an industrial food system, and continuing to work on how we make that happen in an affordable way. Next slide, please. So we started this research in 2017. It now consists of 7 grantees, some of whom have multiple projects all under their particular umbrella. You can see in our little infographic that the parts of the food system that we are focusing on, and that focus was born out of research. It wasn't just sort of cherry picked out of thin air. It was came out of a course of understanding what our assets were, what our gaps were, what our environmental landscape looked like, our cultural landscape, et cetera. There's been a laser focus in this work on filling necessary gaps. So while there are a ton of exciting food projects that need funding or that could be funded in the region, if it falls under the Northwest Arkansas Food Systems Initiative umbrella, it has to be aligned with the initial vision and the strategic work that came out of it. Now, that's not to say that we're not constantly learning and refining, because we are, but when other requests come in that don't align with the needs of the food system initiative, it can't be funded out of this particular strategy. Next slide, please.
Karin, I'll jump in with a question here quick.
Yeah.
You just tell us a little bit more about how you approach that asset mapping phase. What questions were you asking, and how did you, was it field work? Was it stakeholder conversations, actual, research and quantitative data that you had? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so yes to all of those things. And we spent a year on research and strategy development, which at the time felt very luxurious, that it wasn't rushed, but we really did deeply explore all of the different subsystems of a food system. So if you go back to that original diagram, we looked at, we did environmental mapping of land and water assets. We looked at farming practices. We considered what the climate was now and how the climate might change. We did surveys of every farmer and every farmer's market in a 4-county area and asked them a ton of questions about not just their farming practices, but their interest in expanding markets and working in different markets. I guess I tend to talk a lot about produce, but in the initial stages of research, we looked at the entire food system. So we looked at aquaculture, we looked at cattle, we looked at poultry, we looked at grains, we looked at what grows well, what could grow well, what had been grown here in the past. We looked at the role of technology. Are there ways of food production, whether it's indoor agriculture controlled environmental systems that are being utilized in other places, what opportunities that might present in Northwest Arkansas? On the market side, we looked at what the barriers to accessing markets have been and why. We interviewed food buyers, we interviewed chefs, we worked with the food security organizations in our region. We looked at the role of food processing as a potential economic driver, and also there was a large history of produce processing in Northwest Arkansas that had died. Policy, what regulations currently existed that were barriers, and what policies could be implemented that would provide supports, and what might they cost, and where we might have political will or political opposition. And then we looked at the social system. We had done a telephone survey of consumers in the region, asking about their understanding and interest in local food. We looked at the different cultures that were in the region and how people particularly access food. So yes, we looked at everything, and some of it was quantitative, our own survey work. Some of it was, hours spent poring over Ag Census data and trying to parse what it actually could tell us and what the gaps in those data points might be. And we still struggle with which of those data points are good for use as metrics. Acres in production, particular foods that are being produced, number of farmers, farmer demographics. So we looked at all of that.
Sure. Helpful insights. Thank you.
Sure. So next slide is just to reiterate, we looked at the entire food system, and we decided to focus on produce. Molly, if you could go to the next slide, please. Why do we focus on produce? Northwest Arkansas has a large poultry industry. That wasn't something we were going to change or tackle. There's a lot of cattle in Northwest Arkansas, and we looked at that as a potential opportunity to keep beef in the region because most of it is exported to large packing houses. We looked at dairy, which is basically gone. We looked at hog production, lamb production, and we really decided that produce had the least barriers to entry and was already part of what was thriving in Northwest Arkansas and aligned with our goals around regenerative agriculture and healthy food access. And so we could have done everything, but you have to start somewhere. And so we decided that we wanted to start on produce.
I have another question, Karin. Just
Yeah.
as you're covering, you could have done everything, and it seems like you almost did everything, and you assessed so much. Who was leading this work? What sort of team did you have behind it? Was there paid structure? Was it all volunteer work? How was the structure, and how does that impacted, in terms of sustainability?
So before I started, there had been a regional food assessment that was conducted, and that was done by a firm I used to work with. And so the consumer surveys I mentioned, that was done by a major organization that does telephone surveys that we subcontracted with. And there were 4 people on that team. I was one of them. And that was a very broad-based food assessment. It was good to get a kind of big snapshot of the region, but after it was done, there was a decision that we needed to go deeper. When we went deeper, I led that initiative. We had 0 volunteers, and I had over the year 4 different part-time people that I employed to help me with specific things. So the farmers market surveys, I had 2 master's students that I hired to help with that. I had 1 person that helped me in the what's it called? The buyer survey, and those were telephone surveys. And then I had another person that helped me at the end when we were putting the whole report together. So it was a small team, and it was a good thing we had a full year to do it.
Sure. All right, great, thanks. I'll move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so what did we find out? We had a lot of committed but very small farmers. When I say small, most of the growers in Northwest Arkansas are growing on, according to the Ag Census, 5 acres or less, but in reality, most of them are growing on 1 or 2 acres. But through our survey work, we found out that about half of them have a significant amount of acreage that they already own, and they would be willing to grow on and scale up if they had the opportunity to do so. We had a lot of vibrant farmers markets, particularly Bentonville and Fayetteville and Eureka Springs had really great farmers markets. And that was contributing to creating a real culture and interest around local food because it was delicious. One of the things I found most interesting, though, when we did our consumer surveys early on, is that people supported local. In my mind, it's always about the food and the food being fresh and delicious, but it was a desire to support the local economy. And that was a thread that ran very deeply throughout Northwest Arkansas. But when you look at national studies, that still shows up as the #1 reason why people buy local food is to support the local economy. We found the farmers were overwhelmingly interested in scaling up. There's still farmland available in Northwest Arkansas with good soil, but it's being swallowed up quickly by development. And so this, if we wanted to focus on growing fruits and vegetables, we needed to move fast. This couldn't be something that we think about for a decade and then move on, because with the pace of development, the land wasn't going to be available anymore. There had already been significant investment in a culinary school called Brightwater, and the goal of that was to meet the labor demand for hospitality workers in the region. But that school had a focus on food systems and raising the bar on the quality of food available in Northwest Arkansas. We have a land-grant university in Northwest Arkansas. That means that's within the state, the organization that's focusing on agriculture in both teaching, research, and outreach extension, it's called, in the community. And there were a number of people within the land-grant university that were passionate about local foods and were really an asset to thinking about how we could develop the local food system. We also had a food innovation center that was part of the university, we call it AFIC, that had started in 2013 really as a pet project of one faculty member, thinking about how he could help farmers with post-harvest processing to provide more income to them. And so we already had a small facility available to do value-added production. And importantly, we already had a willing funder. Now, I should say willing is qualified because it's not like you just say stuff and money rains down from the heaven. You really have to have a clear plan and goals and metrics. Next slide, please. So we had a whole lot of assets, but why weren't things working? And number one, it was that we didn't have enough produce being grown. So there had been several attempts to create an entity that would move produce from our local growers into wholesale channels. And they kept failing. The reason they were failing is there just simply wasn't enough produce being grown to support a supply chain entity as a for-profit business. They couldn't aggregate enough food to meet anywhere near the benchmarks they would need to meet to have a viable business. If you don't have a supply chain entity moving food into wholesale channels, then your small farmers are constrained by having to deliver food themselves. And we know that buyers, for the most part, don't want to buy from 25 different accounts. They're busy people, and if they're not already tied to national contracts for where they have to buy their food, they're price sensitive and really don't have the time to deal with vetting every single particular purveyor. So without access to markets, the farmers can't expand because they'll just lose money if they grow more food and don't know that they're going to sell it. We found that farmers are pretty willing to grow just about anything if they know they're going to make a profit at the end of the day. So this was really the problem that we had to solve thinking about produce in Northwest Arkansas. We needed to both grow markets and grow farmers in order to grow the markets. Next slide, please.
Karin, another quick question for you.
Sure.
Just seeing, the impact of the system stress, wondering if you've encountered farmers who are maybe experiencing food insecurity themselves. I think that's maybe an irony here that they're the ones providing the food, but are they getting the food that they need, and how much of that is impacted by the food system and some of the challenges within?
I'm really glad you pointed that out, because at the heart of all of the work we're doing, we've decided we need to center the farmer at the heart of that. Because most of our farmers are living at poverty level. And many of them have food because they're growing it themselves, but they're really, in some sense, it's almost like subsistence agriculture for them. And, they're putting up the food that they're going to eat later in the year. So if we don't make sure that there's equity in the system, starting with the farmer, and ending with equity to the people that are going to be consuming the food, then we haven't created a viable food system. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges when we look at a local and equitable food system compared to our multinational system, is that there are people that are being squeezed in our conventional food system all along the way, starting with farmers to farm workers, all the way through people that pack food in warehouses or work in grocery stores that, depending on where they live, are not making enough money to put food on their own tables. And I feel like a lot of times these conversations devolve into a conversation about minimum wage and equity in labor, but ultimately our food system needs to have a foundation in living wages if it's going to result in a vibrant economy across our country.
Sure. Yeah, that's pretty profound, and just encourage everyone to keep that in mind, that potentially the people who are feeding us are unable to feed themselves, and that's where we can play a role in improving and strengthening the food system. So thanks for that, Karin.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of make an aside right now. We knew that access to capital was a challenge that farmers had. And when we originally started thinking about this, we thought about how can we make sure that there's low interest loan money available to farmers for projects on their farms, whether they're small or large, helping them to scale up. And this is another reason you really need to talk to the people who are in the trenches doing the work. We found out that while there was availability of capital for farmers to borrow money, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that they didn't believe that they would earn enough extra money after the investment to make it worthwhile servicing any debt. And so these projects were just on hold, and we ended up converting our lending ideas about developing a lending program into a grant program to farmers. And between 2022 and 2023, we've made grants of up to $15,000 directly to farmers, totaling about $500,000. And that was through a grant to the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, to their marketing program, which is called Arkansas Grown. And farmers really were excited about being able to do what their farm needed to scale up and become wholesale ready when they didn't have to take the risk. And in so many of these projects, when we talk about food systems, we ask farmers to take more risk and earn less. And we need to make sure, again, that we're centering farmers at that point. So our strategy evolved around this system stress that I talked about. And we talk now about growing farmers and growing markets as twin strategies that we need to employ in order to make the food system work. Access to land, making sure that it's still affordable for farmers before it all goes away, access to capital, access to knowledge to meet farmers at every point in their farming journey, whether, I think I want to be a farmer and I don't know where to start, to folks with a little bit of experience, people that are trying to get established on their first farm that have already apprenticed or worked on other farms, to experienced farmers that don't know anything about selling at wholesale or are looking to scale up or meet food safety requirements that they need to do now that they're accessing wholesale markets. And then with our commitment to regenerative agricultural practices, we talk about soil health, and we're funding a soil health initiative in our region. We don't talk about sustainability or regenerative agriculture so much because people have different feelings about that, but everybody wants healthy soil. So we take this approach that all of the practices that make your soil healthy and will help you grow better food and become more profitable, soil health is at the heart of that. On the market side, the supply chain access emerged as the most critical part of it. We have a commitment to healthy food access for all. So that's where food security fits into our particular initiative. We have, I guess it's like a second phase. Once our farmers are growing more food, we know that value-added production will create additional markets for them and help them become more financially viable. And then how do we support local food throughout the rest of the food system? So that's where I look at entrepreneurs in food manufacturing and caterers, chefs, and food trucks, things of that nature that could really buy food anywhere, but have a particular opportunity to use local food and differentiate themselves. Next slide, please.
Karin, looks like we have a question in the chat just about the involvement of registered dietitians involved in this program or in the nutrition education, culinary classes in this work.
So Brightwater, the culinary school, one of their core foundation pillars is on culinary nutrition. And so they do have a dietitian on staff who teaches culinary nutrition education. So everyone in their degree granting program goes through that class. In the land-grant university in extension, there are people that are focused on community health and nutrition. And Dan just dropped in the chat the Whole Health Institute, which is a new institution that's going to be coming to Northwest Arkansas, focused in that areas. And also we have the Northwest campus of the medical school, the state medical school, UAMS, has a particular focus and interest in culinary medicine. So that is happening. It's not directly part of this initiative, but I guess it's not directly part of this initiative, right? Because it is happening. So it didn't have to be something that we added to our wheel directly to support. And Dan's also dropped in the link to the extension, which shows both the culinary nutrition educators as well as our horticulture, where there's a person in every county in Arkansas dedicated to horticulture.
Great. Helpful links. Dan, thanks for dropping those in. Moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, so we have a strategy. We know what our biggest pressure points are. How do you take that from, this is what we think we need, to actually doing something? So some of this work was done alongside the initial research and some of it came after. But the first step was landscape assessment. So we think we need farmer training. What are different kinds of farmer training programs across the country? How do they work? What do they cost? Who participates? Why do they participate? So for each of these things that we thought we needed to support in the region, we did a landscape assessment. And we followed that up with site visits and interviews to those that we thought were either best in class or projects that align with our specific region and direction. So comparable goals and mission. Some of those site visits and interviews we did with our potential project partners before we had a grant made to them, and some of them we did after we did an initial planning grant. But a lot of that learning we did side by side, identifying and recruiting partners where available was something that came out of the initial research, right? We did a comprehensive food system assessment. We knew who was already there, and we had strong ideas about who was ideologically aligned, who had the capacity to take on more. And so out of this process, we were able to start working with potential partners. Now, this is something that's a little bit unusual and is both a strength and a challenge of this particular project. Where you have a potential partner, but you have your own very specific idea of what kinds of programs are necessary to implement a system strategy, and you're asking one entity to pick up a piece of that, you need to make sure they're really aligned, that they're aligned on mission, their vision for how to accomplish it is going to be the same as you, that their internal bureaucracy is not going to stand in the way, because essentially as a funder, we're saying we need all of these specific pieces to make the food system work. And we're approaching one particular entity and saying, what do you think we need for our food system? And trying to make sure that they come up with a project that aligns with our idea. And in some ways, it's worked really beautifully. I would take the example of the University of Arkansas. They've created, out of this work, the Center for Arkansas Farms and Food. And the people within the university that I started working with early on, learning from them when I started research, were really ideologically aligned, really passionate and wanting to do exactly what we thought we needed. In other cases, it hasn't worked so well, where you're trying to squeeze, a square peg into a round hole, and it's a challenge and hasn't always worked. So I would say that's both, a potential strength and a real challenge when you have an idea of a strategy and you're trying to impose it on others, as opposed to a traditional grant making process where people have their own ideas and come to you and say, hey, I want to do this, will you fund it? It's quite different. And I think we'll be very successful in the long run in this work, but it's not without a word of caution that what we're doing is a little bit different. And then I just want to say that part of the reason that I think this works is because we're remaining true to our core values, that we have a vision that we're true to. And while other food organizations have come and said, hey, we're part of the food system, can you fund us? We've had to say, we have a specific budget to fund things that we think are necessary to make the food system work. And we love what you're doing, but I'm sorry, you're going to have to look elsewhere for funding. And now maybe it's elsewhere within the Walton Family Foundation, or maybe it's other kinds of grantees. And I'm always happy to steer people to funding sources that I'm aware of, but we can't fund everything. And so we have to have guardrails and we have to stay true to those. Next slide, please. So moving from identifying project partners and projects that we thought would make the food system work, we then had to figure out what success looks like and how it's measured. So this has been an ongoing process, and I think we're now 5 years into implementation and taking another hard look at what are we measuring, why, and how do we measure change? So if we're looking at number of acres in production, are we trying to look at the ag census every 5 years and see how that's changed? But we don't also control all the things that go into the ag census. So we're trying to make sure that we have metrics for our overall work that look at acres in production, that look at amount of food that's being produced from a quantitative perspective, that we can go back with the ag census and look every 5 years. But we're also having to make sure that our grantees have specific metrics that they're looking at. So, for example, the farm school tracks their graduates and they know who started a farm and how many acres that is, and they're trying to provide us back with as much information as they can so we can roll that up to our overall metrics to see if we're actually growing farmers. Timeline. Each of these projects came with a specific timeline for implementation. Part of that was part of the strategy. that I think this project is going to take X number of years. And then in our initial planning grants to each grantee, they came up with their own timeline and budget. And we tried to align those to make sure that it all made sense. So that's also been a little bit of an iterative process, because from my perspective, I'm making my best guesses on what a third-party organization is going to be able to do and what it's going to cost them based on my research. But we really look to each grantee to come up with proposals, both in the planning phases and then in implementation phases, to come up with their budget and timeline. And then the last thing is working with grantees. Have worked, and my role's changing a little bit now, very closely with each of the grantees in this initiative to help them along the way, to make sure that we are still aligned with them and that I'm learning about what their challenges are as they move into implementation. So we're not changing our scope, we're staying true to what's in and what's out, but everybody's learning every day as we move into spaces that haven't been activated in the region, and trying to make sure we're understanding our grantees' challenges and working with them to solve problems. Next slide, please. So this is the same slide I showed before that shows our food system, the growing farmers on the top, the growing markets on the bottom, and the different organizations that we're funding. And I think I'll just pause here for 1 minute. The rest of the presentation, I can run through the different projects and share with you where we landed and what everybody's doing, but want to take just a breath here and see if there are any other questions.
There's one in the chat just about best in class examples for farmers markets and how they play a role in food security. I know Daniel dropped several helpful links there, and maybe you'll get to that in some of the projects, but any insights to share there?
So farmers markets, I mean, there are great farmers markets across the country, and I'd say we've really seen a renaissance in that in the last 10 to 15 years. I would say part of best in class is also aligning with your region and what's being produced. So farmers markets that are financially successful, you know, I came from New York City originally, and I could say that they're New York City's green markets with more than 40 markets across New York City, many in underserved areas, has combined with youth markets where in areas that don't have the population to support a full-on farmers market, they work with community-based youth groups to provide education to them. It's actually business education, and they run a farm stand that's based on local produce. They have some really innovative projects trying to make sure that farmers markets are available everywhere, and to engage community groups in making sure. I think in terms of food security and food access, being able to accept EBT benefits at farmers markets and at farm stands is really important. I think we have a lot of policy work to continue to do there. It's available, but in most markets, you have to go up and you have to swipe your card, and then you get tokens, and then you have to spend the tokens at the booths. And I think there's a little bit of a stigma, and it's not the most convenient thing to have to do at a market. Online SNAP is a possibility in some states, but it's too expensive for most farmers markets to handle, and it's way too expensive, to the tune of $10,000 to get your website approved to accept EBT benefits. So I think that there's a lot of policy work that we can do on that front to provide more food. I think there are many farmers markets that are combined with gleaning initiatives, so that at the end of the day, food is donated, because farmers really can't sell the food that's been sitting in the hot sun at the end of the day. Yeah, I can't think of anything else that's a really clear food security initiative. And this is like also where we get a little touchy, right? Like we talked about, farmers aren't making very much money, and now we're looking at them to be part of our food and security solutions. And while they do a lot and do donate a lot of food, I think we needed to be looking outside of the farmer making the donation, or outside of asking the farmer to make their food more affordable.
Sure. All right. Well, I know you have some helpful examples to get to, and I think this group will find them particularly interesting, and especially one around the concept of food hubs, which was a big takeaway from a food security action planning event that we had last week. So unless there are any other questions, we'll move ahead if that works for you, Karin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
So, well, I'm going to focus on our first few grantees that are really the core of this work. The first one I mentioned already is the Center for Arkansas Farms and Food. This is a little bit interesting. It's part of the University of Arkansas, but it is actually part of the Division of Agriculture and not the college. This is an area where bureaucratic problems have sometimes arisen. It's not part of the college because then we would have to charge anyone who wanted to attend the same 4-credit tuition rate as somebody enrolled in the university. The Division of Agriculture was also where the people with the passion were. And so it's, I guess, a standalone certificate program under the University of Arkansas umbrella, but really under the Division of Agriculture. And they're doing 3 things. The first is an 11-month hands-on farm school. So you think you want to be a farmer, you don't know anything, what do? You can learn everything in this really intense hands-on program that runs across all 4 seasons. One of the things that I really love that they do is they have a full business curriculum. They believe, and I think rightly so, that if you don't understand the economics of your farm, you are not going to be a successful entrepreneur. And I loved at the end of the first cohort when they graduated, I was talking to Brian, who was just starting his own farm, and he said, I learned that I don't pick fast enough. And if I don't pick faster, and he had a specific cost that he was going to incur as a farmer for his labor, because he was valuing his own labor. The second thing they're doing is a farmer's apprenticeship program, and that could be either a 1 or a 2-year program. And I think it's a lot like dating, because they're really looking to match farm apprentices with farm hosts to make sure it's a symbiotic relationship that works both ways. The farmers get a stipend from the school because they recognize that the farmer is taking time away from their farming practice to actually teach people, but they also require that the farm apprentices get paid. And so this is part of the commitment to having equity across the food system. And I would say the amount of volunteerism and underpayment in food nonprofits is just staggering to me, that where we talk about equity across the system, but then in our own nonprofits, we're always struggling for money and don't have enough money to pay people. So I really love that the apprenticeship program is paid. And then the last thing they do is continuing education, and that's for existing farmers, helping farmers scale up with food safety, anything that they might need. They recently did a demonstration on equipment, so moving from hand harvesting to mechanized harvesting, what is the best equipment for that sort of mid-scale agriculture. Next slide, please. The Northwest Arkansas Land Trust emerged as a really strong partner for our land access programs. And I wasn't sure that they were going to be when I first started talking to them. Sometimes there's a tension between farming and conservation, but the executive director was very clear. She came from a farming background, that she really saw that preserving farms was totally aligned with their mission. They now have 3 programs. The first is very straightforward, FarmLink. It's, again, dating, that's a theme, I guess, matching land owners who are looking to sell their land with farmers who are looking for land. It's a website, but Susan does a lot of work behind the scenes. Not everybody creates a profile, and she wants to make sure that the matches are really good matches. Next slide. They've started a farmland access fund, which is they can use the money to purchase agricultural land easements alongside a farmer purchasing new land. So if you're a farmer and the land is too expensive for you, you can apply to have the land trust purchase an agricultural easement. It does require that the land either partly be in conservation and the balance of it be in farming, following guidelines in a plan that you'll write together. So when you go to sell the land, you're not going to get a windfall, but it allows you to essentially reduce your cost of the land by about 50%. And then the third program, next slide, they just launched last week. This one was a long time coming. We've purchased a 100-acre parcel of land in Northwest Arkansas. It's a gorgeous piece of land with great soil, live water, and they're looking to incubate 3 farmers, each on 15-acre parcels, and hopefully in the future transition those farmers from leasing into ownership. So this is a way to try to accelerate that mid-scale farm as opposed to having people kind of be out there looking for land on their own. So we're trying to find different ways for people to access land. Next slide, please. So food hubs, there's a very famous quote in our food hub community, which is, if you've seen one food hub, you've seen one food hub. Food hubs don't have a standard definition. So I'm going to start by saying that when I talk about food hubs, I'm talking about a place to aggregate food and distribute it, local food. Food hubs can be nonprofit, they can be agricultural cooperatives, they can be for-profit. The one that we're supporting is nonprofit, and its goal is kind of three parts. One is to support local farmers with continuing education. So there's some overlap with what the Center for Arkansas Farms and Food is doing on food safety educations and wholesale readiness, and they do work on some projects together. But this is really critical because when they first opened, people were bringing food in a garbage bag. Like, that's how they were harvesting. And if we're going to move food into wholesale channels, they have a lot of learning to do. The second piece is straightforward produce sales and aggregation. In terms of nonprofit mission, this really falls outside the nonprofit mission. And it's really more of a business activity, except to the extent that if they weren't doing it, the farmers wouldn't have any market access. So I think it falls within a nonprofit scope because it's really a farm incubator, and it's incubating farmers till they get to a scale large enough to deal with your traditional wholesale buyers. And then the last piece of this aligns with the overall project goals from the beginning about healthy food access for all. And the food security piece of it is working in partnership with a federally qualified health clinic to provide weekly farm bags in season of local produce. And they sell those at cost, and we have grant funding that is double your dollars or double up food bucks, which typically goes to farmers markets, but they've extended it to the food hub. And so if you pay for your bag with your EBT card, you essentially get it for half price. Next slide, please. So the last piece of our vision was around food processing. How do we help our farmers scale up? How do we build economic development around local food and help incubate businesses? Northwest Arkansas, particularly in Springdale, has a rich history, and this is a billboard from 1952, which describes Springdale as market center of the Ozarks. It's also a low-income community, has high incidence of diet-related disease. That community clinic has its headquarters there. So it was an area where we really wanted to make sure there was healthy food access and also support economic development. So we decided to build a facility that would do two things. It would be a home for Spring Creek Food Hub and a place for produce aggregation and distribution and for that farmer education, but also would be a place for produce processing. If you could jump 2 slides ahead. For produce processing and for food entrepreneurs like food trucks and caterers to produce their food. That last piece doesn't align 100% with our overall Growing Farmers and Growing Markets initiative. To the extent that local food entrepreneurs do buy local food, it does, but they're not required to. But it was a gap that we found in our research and we felt was really important for supporting beginning stage entrepreneurs, those people that are moving from their kitchen into their first production space, that they would have a commercial facility that they can produce in. So we've broken ground on this facility. As I said, it will be in Springdale. You can jump to the next slide. It's a 45,000 square foot facility that will house the food hub. It will have a produce processing space that is aimed at mid-scale production and mid-scale processing that is aimed at fresh cut and frozen vegetables. So again, focusing and being true to our core mission on helping farmers. And then the last piece is this food entrepreneur space for food trucks and caterers. And this should be live about a year from now. So what did we learn? I think I've touched on all of these pieces. The funding strategy is really unique, that this is coming from a funder and that it's a systems approach, that we're not just awarding grants or funding one-off programs or projects. We could make the same philanthropic investments in food projects, but not have the same impact if we hadn't been thinking about it system-wide. Fail fast and fixed. We did have a food hub partner that failed, not for want of our trying to support them. Everybody was really disappointed, but we're moving on and we're finding and moving forward. And that's a commitment to the system, that we know that without the food hub, this project won't work. I mentioned that I work deeply with the grantees, and I think as an outside consultant, I'm in a unique position where I'm both supporting the funder and also supporting the grantees in a way that isn't traditional, but my expertise and the fact that I hold the strategy and vision helps move the grantees along. So happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Karin. And I mean, to conclude our comments, collective comments, just want to really reemphasize the fact that healthy people depend on healthy food systems. Broken food systems fuel hunger, they limit livelihoods, they can lead to crisis. So like Karin said, we really need to think differently about food, because food is a basic human need. It's not just a commodity. And by building a more robust food system, we create a more resilient community. So that's the question I'll pose to all of you. How might we make our food system more resilient, one where all community members can thrive? I think we know that's by thinking outside of the box based on Karin's lessons and learnings, challenging the status quo, especially that of the funding strategies. We need to approach things differently, especially if we're trying to tackle such a complex issue and something so complex as a food system. So I'll pose that to the group. Also want to pose maybe one final question to you, Karin, how this is a complex issue, and then it might feel like there needs to be some trade-off. So maybe we focus on farming, but then we have to sacrifice the economic piece of it. What lessons do you have in tackling it all and not necessarily trading one for another, but finding balance within, because we need to move all pieces forward, but I could see how some groups might find that a little daunting.
Yeah, you know, we still sometimes come back to conversations with our core group where they're like, why are we trying to do everything? I'm like, okay, first, we're not trying to do everything, right? We're not tackling anything other than produce right now. We're not looking at controlled environment agriculture. We're really being true to our small fruit and vegetable growers and helping them grow and scale. And we know that they need market access. The other supports are really there to bolster it. So, yeah, we're not trying to do everything. We're really being clear about what it is we need to do to support our food system and what the outcomes would be. I think if our particular goal was more focused on food security, it might look a bit different, because while local food is fresh and delicious and supports local economies, we might decide that there are other ways to make sure that everybody has food access other than trying to grow it on 1 to 2 acre plots that is expensive for each particular grower to grow and then expensive for people to buy. So I think really being clear on what your goals are and how you're going to achieve them is critical.
Sure. It's great insights. I'll throw the next slide up on the screen just in case anyone's interested in learning more about the work that we're each leading and involved in, but looks like we have maybe 1 minute left for any final questions, comments.
And I'm going to drop my email address into the chat in case anybody wants to follow up.
Sure, that'd be great. And we'll make sure everyone gets the recording and has this information so you can follow up. We know it's a lot to digest and a big topic, but we really appreciate your time today and your participation. And we ask you to please keep an eye out for that information and continue to advocate for this important work.
Molly and Karin, thank you guys so much. We are at the end of this session. We'll let everybody on this email and beyond know when we clean up the video and get ready to post it. Please feel free to share at your leisure with all of your constituents as this conversation lives beyond this current Zoom session. Also giving a heads up, tomorrow is another Zoom session between the county and the city with Brad Lawnberger and Yvonne Gonzalez of Place Strategies, who've done quite a bit of urban planning work around the country. Tomorrow is about cultivating planning and development alignment between cities and counties. And so you definitely want to get the information about that as well. So thank you all very much, and please feel free to contact Molly, Karin, myself, or Lindsay Hernandez with Impact Austin if you guys have any other follow-up questions. And Molly, thank you. Good luck with all the great work that that you are doing. Austin is definitely punching above its weight class on a lot of the stuff that you guys are moving forward. So thank you very much for your work.
Thanks for the
Thanks so
opportunity.
much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.